Every so often in history, a figure emerges who isn't just a leader, but a force of nature. They're the ones who reshape the world through sheer will, redrawing maps with blood and iron. They leave behind legacies that are as brilliant as they are terrifying. They are conquerors, innovators, and tyrants, and few embody this mix of creative genius and destructive fury as completely as a man born in the late 18th century, in the rolling hills of what is now South Africa. A man whose name would become a legend, whispered with a mixture of awe and terror for centuries to come. Shaka Zulu. He was a military genius who forged an empire with revolutionary weapons and terrifying new tactics. He was a leader who united a scattered people into a proud nation. But the legend of Shaka Zulu is built on a foundation of absolute fear. This is the story of how the brilliant mind that created an empire also terrorized his own people. It's the story of a boy, cast out and bullied, who rose to become a king, only to find that the very demons that drove him to power would ultimately consume him and his kingdom in a fire of his own making. To understand the man, you have to understand the world that made him. Southern Africa in the late 1700s wasn't a land of big empires. It was a complex mosaic of hundreds of small, independent, Nguni-speaking chiefdoms. Life revolved around the clan, loyalty was local, and warfare, while it happened, was often more ritual than outright slaughter. Battles were usually brief clashes to settle disputes over land or cattle, with more posturing than killing. Warriors, armed with long, flimsy throwing spears called assegais, would chuck their weapons from a distance. Whichever side felt they were losing would just retreat before things got too bloody. It was a world of contained conflict, a sort of dance of limited warfare. Into this world, around 1787, a child named Shaka was born. His birth wasn't a celebration, it was a scandal. He was the illegitimate son of Senzangakona, chief of a small, unimportant clan called the Zulu, and a woman named Nandi from the neighboring Langeni people. Their union broke clan customs, and that transgression would forever stain their child. When Nandi's pregnancy became obvious, Senzangakona scornfully dismissed it, claiming she wasn't pregnant, just suffering from an intestinal beetle called an ishaka. So, that's the name the boy was given, Shaka. Not a blessing, but a cruel, permanent reminder of his illegitimate origins. Even though his father eventually took Nandi as a third wife, the relationship was poisoned from day one. Shaka grew up in his father's homestead, a fatherless boy in a deeply patriarchal society, surrounded by the contempt of his father's other wives and kids. He was an outsider, a living symbol of shame. The bullying was relentless, a daily torment that sharpened his mind and hardened his heart. It got so bad that Senzangakona finally drove Nandi and her young son away, casting them into exile. For years they wandered, looking for refuge, but they were met with contempt everywhere. Nandi's own people, the Langeni, despised her. When a severe famine hit in 1802, they were cast out yet again, unwanted and alone. These were Shaka's formative years. Years of hunger, humiliation, and the searing pain of rejection. It was here that his brutal worldview was forged. He learned that personal connections were a weakness, that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, and that power was the only thing that truly mattered. Adversity wasn't just shaping him, it was sharpening him into a weapon. Their wanderings finally led them to the land of the Mfecane, a powerful paramountcy ruled by a wise and ambitious chief named Dingiswawo. Dingiswawo was a visionary, already toying with new ideas about military organization. He welcomed the exiles, and under his protection, the teenage Shaka, now tall and incredibly strong, finally found a place where his fierce determination was seen as an asset, not a source of shame. At 23, Shaka was drafted into Dingiswawo's age-grade regiments, the Yabutho. For the next 6 years, he served as a warrior, and it was on the battlefield that the outcast boy began his transformation. He quickly made a name for himself, not just for his courage, but for his mind. He looked at the ritualized warfare of his time and didn't see tradition. He saw inefficiency. He saw weakness. The standard practice of throwing the long assegai from a distance drove him crazy. He saw warriors disarm themselves with one toss, only to give the enemy a weapon to throw right back. He saw battles won and lost with hardly any real contact. A dance of projectiles that decided nothing. Shaka's mind, honed by a lifetime of survival, saw a different way. A more direct, more brutal, more final way. He started to innovate. He tossed aside the clumsy ox-hide sandals other warriors wore, arguing they just slowed him down. He pushed for a new way of fighting. Forget throwing spears from afar. Instead, charge forward, close the distance, and engage in terrifying, up-close hand-to-hand combat. He envisioned a fight to the death, not some ritualized skirmish. Dingiswayo was impressed by the young warrior's ferocity and strategic thinking and took Shaka under his wing. Shaka became one of Dingiswayo's most trusted commanders. Yet even then, you could see a difference in their philosophies. Dingiswayo, while a conqueror, was known to be more lenient, building alliances through diplomacy. Shaka, on the other hand, believed in total war. He argued that Dingiswayo's mercy was a weakness, that letting enemies off the hook just gave them a chance to rise again. Shaka's goal wasn't just to defeat his enemies, it was to annihilate them. In 1816, word came that Shaka's father, Senzangakona, had died. Shaka's elder half-brother, Sigujana, took the throne of the tiny Zulu clan, seeing his chance, and with the backing of Dingiswayo's army, Shaka marched on his former home. He assassinated Sigujana, and, with Dingiswayo's blessing, claimed the chieftainship of the Zulus. At the time, the Zulu were a minor clan of less than 1,500 people, but from the day Shaka returned, they began their unstoppable march to greatness. The outcast had come home, not as a beggar, but as a king, and he was about to unleash a revolution. With the Zulu clan under his absolute control, Shaka immediately started putting his radical military reforms into action. He wasn't just a warrior with ideas anymore. He was a king who could forge an army in his own image. His goal was to create a military machine unlike anything Southern Africa had ever seen, built on 3 pillars: new weapons, new tactics, and a new kind of discipline forged in terror. First to go was the long-throwing assegai. Shaka called it a coward's weapon. He replaced it with his own invention, a short, broad-bladed stabbing spear with a thick, heavy shaft. It was called the iklwa. The name is said to mimic the sickening sucking sound the spear made as it was stabbed into and pulled from an enemy's body. The iklwa wasn't for throwing, it was for killing, up close and personal. Shaka trained his men to use their large, reinforced cowhide shields to parry an enemy's blow, hook their shield aside, and deliver a fatal stab to the chest. This turned combat from a distant exchange into a brutal, intimate act of slaughter. This devastating 1-2 punch of the short spear and large shield has been compared to the gladius and scutum of the Roman legions, and it gave the Zulu a terrifying edge. But weapons are useless without the tactics to use them. Shaka's most brilliant innovation was a formation known as the Buffalo Horns, Izimpondo Zainiathi. This system was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The Zulu army, or Impi, was split into 3 parts. The largest group, the chest, Izaifuba, was made up of the most experienced veterans. Their job was to hit the enemy head-on and pin them in place. They were the anvil, while the chest held the enemy in a bloody stalemate. 2 other groups, the horns, Izimpondo, would deploy. Made up of the youngest and fastest warriors, the horns would race out to the left and right, sweeping around the enemy's flanks to cut off any chance of retreat. Trapped between the grinding power of the chest and the closing horns, the enemy would panic, break, and be annihilated. Finally, Shaka always held a 4th group in reserve, the loins, Umuva. These were typically older warriors who would sit with their backs to the battle so they wouldn't get swept up in the heat of the moment. Shaka would direct the battle from a high vantage point, using runners and hand signals to deploy the loins wherever they were needed, to plug a gap, reinforce the chest, or deliver the final crushing blow. The 3rd pillar of his revolution was discipline. He introduced training that was brutally rigorous. Warriors were forced on marches of over 50 miles a day. often running barefoot over thorns and rocks to toughen their feet. In mock battles, failure could mean a severe beating or even death. Shaka understood the psychology of fear. He made his soldiers more terrified of him than they could ever be of the enemy. Failure in battle meant certain execution by their own commanders. Cowardice was unthinkable. If a warrior deserted, his entire family would be brutally executed. This was the machine Shaka built, an army with deadly new weapons, revolutionary tactics, and a discipline forged in absolute terror. The old dance of warfare was over. Shaka had introduced a new kind of war to southern Africa. A war of total extermination. Shaka's new army didn't have to wait long for a test. A storm was gathering to the north. The most powerful chiefdom in the region was the Ndwandwe, led by the ruthless king Zwaide. A year after Shaka took power, Zwaide ambushed and killed Shaka's mentor, Dingiswayo. With Dingiswayo gone, the last restraint on Shaka was removed, but it also put him directly in Zwaide's crosshairs. A showdown was inevitable. Zwaide saw the rising Zulu chief as a threat that had to be eliminated. In April of 1818, Zwaide sent a massive army of over 10,000 warriors to crush the upstart king. Shaka's own forces were much smaller, maybe 4,000 men. He was outnumbered 2-1. This was the ultimate test, but Shaka refused to fight on Zwaide's terms. In a brilliant tactical move, he used the landscape itself as a weapon. He had his men burn the countryside in the path of the advancing Ndwandwe, so they couldn't live off the land. He had his people hide their cattle and grain, making sure his own army stayed supplied while the enemy starved. The climax came at the Battle of Gokakli Hill. Shaka chose his ground perfectly, placing his smaller force on a strategic hill. As the main Ndwandwe force charged up the steep slope, they were met by the disciplined Zulu ranks. The terrain worked against the Ndwandwe's numbers, and Shaka's men, with their deadly iklwa, held their ground. As the enemy grew exhausted, Shaka unleashed his masterstroke. For the first time on a major battlefield, he deployed the buffalo horns. The horns swept down from the sides of the hill, enveloping the attackers. The Ndwandwe, trapped and disoriented, were slaughtered, losing thousands of men, including 5 of Zwaide's sons. Gokakli Hill was the moment Shaka's military system was proven. But he wasn't done. He went on the offensive, and in a later battle, he completely crushed Zwaide's remaining power, shattering the Ndwandwe kingdom for good. He then turned his attention to the clans that had scorned him in his youth, impaling the men of the Langani on the stakes of their own fences. He fought a war of total conquest. Defeated tribes were given a choice: join the Zulu kingdom and become Zulu, or be wiped out. Young men were absorbed into his regiments, their old clan loyalties erased and replaced with a singular loyalty to Shaka. In just a few years, he transformed the Zulu from a tiny chiefdom into the most powerful empire in southern Africa. By the height of his power, Shaka ruled over an estimated 250,000 people and commanded an army of more than 50,000 warriors. The outcast boy hadn't just conquered his enemies. He had built a nation. The creation of the Zulu Empire was a marvel, but it came at a terrifying cost. Shaka's reign triggered a period of unprecedented chaos and mass migration known as the Mfecane, or the crushing. His armies swept through the region like a firestorm, depopulating huge territories and sending entire peoples fleeing for their lives. This created a domino effect of violence that spread across southern Africa, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 1 to 2 million people. Within his empire, Shaka ruled with absolute, brutal control. His word was law. Punishment was swift and horrifying. Those who displeased the king were clubbed to death, impaled, or had their necks twisted until they broke. A network of spies ensured that any whispered complaint could earn you a death sentence. His traumatic childhood left him with a deep distrust of personal bonds, and this led to radical social policies. He believed family ties threatened the total loyalty he demanded from his soldiers. So he forbade his warriors from marrying. Their purpose was not to be husbands or fathers, but to be soldiers, instruments of his will. Shaka himself never married, and any woman in his royal household found pregnant was immediately executed. along with the man responsible. To him, heirs were just future rivals. His reign was a paradox. He forged a powerful sense of Zulu identity where none had existed. He built a centralized state with a brutal but predictable system of laws. But this order was kept through a pervasive culture of terror. The Zulu were now a formidable nation, but they lived under the shadow of a king who saw threats everywhere and whose solution to every problem was bloodshed. For all his suppression of human connection, there was one person Shaka seemed to truly love: his mother, Nandi. She had shared his exile and his humiliation, and she held the powerful title of Nalavukazi, the great she-elephant. She was his anchor. In October 1827, that anchor came loose. Nandi died of dysentery. When the news reached Shaka, the man who built an empire on cold logic completely shattered. He was consumed by a tidal wave of grief, so violent it threatened to drown his entire kingdom. What followed was a period of forced mourning, so extreme it bordered on mass insanity. Shaka ordered that no crops be planted for a year. No milk was to be used. It was to be poured onto the ground so that even the calves might know the pain of losing a mother. Anyone who didn't show enough grief at public gatherings was executed on the spot. The most horrific decree was that any woman who became pregnant during the mourning period was to be killed, along with her husband. Bringing new life into a world where his mother was gone was, in Shaka's broken mind, an unforgivable crime. The kingdom descended into terror and famine. It's believed that as many as 7,000 people were killed in the initial wave of Shaka's grief, either by his direct order or in the chaos as people accused and killed others to prove their own loyalty. Shaka's grief morphed into a raging paranoia. He trusted no one. He sent his exhausted armies on pointless campaigns, seemingly just to spread his misery. The brilliant strategist was now acting like a deranged tyrant. The fear he had so masterfully used to build his empire was now turning against him. His own chiefs and family began to realize that the king was no longer a protector, but a threat to their very survival. By September 1828, the Zulu kingdom was stretched to its breaking point. Shaka had sent most of his army on a grueling campaign far to the north, leaving his royal kraal critically unprotected. For the conspirators in his inner circle, this was the chance they'd been waiting for. His own half-brothers, Dingaan and Malangana, men who had every reason to fear they'd be his next victims, had been plotting against him. They were joined by a key accomplice, a high-ranking servant named Mabapa. The assassination was brutally simple. On or around September 24th, 1828, as Shaka was meeting with visitors, the conspirators made their move. Mbopa created a diversion, and as the king's attention turned, Dingaan and Malangana lunged forward, stabbing him with their spears. The death of Shaka Zulu was as unceremonious as his birth. His own kin dumped his body into an empty grain pit and filled it with stones and mud. The exact location of his grave remains unknown to this day. He was around 41 years old. According to Zulu oral tradition, his last words weren't a plea for mercy, but a chilling prophecy. "Are you stabbing me, kings of the earth?" he supposedly called out. "You will come to an end by killing one another." Another version says he warned them that it wouldn't be they who would rule, but white people who will come up from the sea. Dingaan quickly took the throne and began a bloody purge of anyone still loyal to Shaka. He eased some of the most hated policies, allowing warriors to marry, which helped secure the army's loyalty. He would rule for 12 years before, in a grim echo of Shaka's prophecy, he himself was overthrown and killed by another half-brother, Impande. Shaka's story is one of genius born from suffering and power that led to madness. So what's the final verdict? Was he a nation builder who used brutal means to achieve a necessary end, or was he a bloodthirsty tyrant whose cruelty overshadowed his genius? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by the epic and often brutal stories of history's greatest leaders, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more. Shaka Zulu's reign lasted only 12 years, but his impact was immense. He took a tiny, insignificant clan and forged it into the most formidable indigenous empire in southern Africa. His military innovations, the iklwa, the buffalo horns formation, and the system of brutal discipline revolutionized warfare in the region. His tactics are still studied in military academies around the world. He created the Zulu nation, uniting hundreds of chiefdoms into a single entity with a shared identity that endures to this day. Yet, this legacy of glory is forever tied to a legacy of fear. His conquests fueled the Mfecane, a disaster that reshaped the entire subcontinent. His rule was a reign of terror, marked by mass executions and a paranoia that ultimately ate him alive. Shaka is a figure of immense contradiction, a brilliant strategist and a paranoid tyrant, a nation builder and a mass murderer. He created a military so powerful that decades after his death, in 1879, the Zulu kingdom inflicted one of the most humiliating defeats in British colonial history at the Battle of Azandlawana, a testament to his enduring military machine. His story is a powerful and terrifying reminder that the line between a visionary and a monster is often written in blood, and that the fires of genius, when unchecked, can burn down the very world they were meant to create.